have a big announcement. I am secretly the Princess of Genovia. Oh wait, no, that's not me. That's someone else. Ha! Hello, welcome to Christy Grace Scarlet Pen. I am an author, creativity chaser, and book lover. Today, I'm doing another book versus movie. You probably guessed from the first bit in the beginning of this video, but I did the Princess Diaries. If you didn't know, Princess Diaries actually, with the beautiful Anne Hathaway, Julie Andrews, was based off of books. And I'm saying books because that is one of my first points that I want to point out. I read book 1, The Princess Diaries. There's actually a lot of books in this series, a lot of different ones, and the movie itself combined a couple of books into one film, which was really interesting to find out, especially when I got to basically the middle of the movie at the end of the first book and went, oh, so we don't get the rest. But, you know, there was quite a few differences in this one also, so let's get into all of the changes. So first and foremost, Princess Diaries is actually written as a diary. So it's called The Princess Diaries because it was written originally in diary format. Mia is writing in her diary every day, sometimes multiple times a day, sometimes she skips a day. As a teenager in school, I actually read a bunch of books that were in diary format also, and I really liked those when I was a teenager, so this wasn't anything too super unusual for me. I'd sort of done this style before, and actually it's kind of fun sometimes to get that element of, you know, it's literally her personal diary, and it makes a lot more sense as to why it's called Princess Diaries, because in the film you really only have one diary sort of bit, and that's at the very end with her on the plane as she flies to Genovia. So it was a little bit odd, I guess, when you're looking at the grand scheme of the film, Princess Diaries, but when you read the book, it makes total sense. So there were some huge differences, let me tell you. One of the big changes which made a huge difference to the story was actually that in the books, Mia's dad was alive. So in the film, her dad had already died previously before the film started, and her grandma came. Beautiful Julie Andrews, Queen Clarice comes to inform her she's a princess and to take her on this journey, when in actuality in the books, her dad's alive and comes to her, and the reason he comes to her and tells her she's a princess is actually because, spoiler alert, he had recently had cancer and can no longer have any more children, and because of that she is the only heir because he can't have kids, not because he's dead. So, whereas in the movie it was because he died, that he couldn't have any more heirs. And so you actually get the dad character in the book. It's interesting because he's an interesting character. He's not very kind. Again, with this whole theme of movie characters becoming a lot more likable than in the book, because in books, characters are pretty sucky people. Let me just say that. Her dad was really stiff, really rigid. He was definitely a prince every day of his life, and he just had that, what's that word? Aristotle? No, he's a snob. Let's just go with snob. He's a bit of a snob, and he's royal, so he's just sort of been raised that way. And the beautiful Julie Andrews' grandmother that we know and love from the film, first of all, the grandma character in the book is just, she's awful, okay? Let's go with awful. That's what I'm gonna say. She's terrible. She mostly only speaks in French and requires Mia to speak to her in French, which means she actually also wants her to call her Grand Mia, I think is how you pronounce it, instead of Grandma. And she is a bitch and a half. I'm not afraid to say that. She's awful. She's a terrible, terrible, awful person, but she's very, I think it's more so that she's so entitled, she's so used to being royal, she's so used to getting the best of things and getting exactly what she wants, regardless of people's feelings around her. For me, I feel like she's a little bit of a sociopath, but she is definitely not Julie Andrews material, let me tell you. She is an unlikable hag. I really just hate her so much. She was awful. She still gives Mia the princess lessons, but they are just it's hard to read with this grandmother character. I just thoroughly hate her. She was not likable. She's definitely no singing Julie Andrews. Another thing that was so disappointing is one of my favorite characters in the film was Joe. He is not in the book. There is a driver slash bodyguard called Lars, but poor Joe. I love Joe. He was so fun, and there was that dynamic between him and Queen Clarice. There's no Joe in the book. I missed him. It was very sad, teardrop. I was very sad that he wasn't there. Lars didn't really have too much of a role in the book. He was just sort of background. He was there, he was bodyguard, he was driver, whatever. Like, it was eh. Whereas Joe had like a really great personality, a great dynamic to add to the film. There is a whole brand new character that was nowhere near the film in the book. I think also it's important to note that in the book she starts out finding out when she's 14, not 16. I think she's 16 in the film because she's able to drive her Mustang. She's 14 when the first book starts, and she still desperately wants to do school in her school for the rest of her time, you know, as a school child. Third time saying school. And there's actually a character in her school which isn't in the film, which her name is Tina. And she's the daughter of a very rich guy, and so she always has a bodyguard. And but everybody stays away from her because they think that's weird, and they consider her to be a freak because of that. They think she's a freak, which is awful, but very teenagery. It also, though, brings in this element of being called a freak. In the film, they touch on that, and one of my favorite lines, just in case I've done enough of a freak already, let's add a tiara. That's one of the fun lines in the early beginning of the film. But this idea of being labelled something weird and as a freak and as something stupid and annoying or whatever in school was like a throwaway, I guess, a throwaway line or idea in the film, whereas in the book it's really prevalent. It's really obvious that this is why it would be such a big deal to be called a freak in that school, in that environment, in that situation. And it's because of people like this Tina character, where if you've got a bodyguard or you are super uber rich and, you know, like to the point where you have to be concerned about being kidnapped, that's weird and people don't like you because of it. But Tina was a beautiful character. I loved her. She was so nice, but just because she was, I think it said that she was a bit dumpy, and also she has this bodyguard hanging around her all the time. People just didn't want to go anywhere near her, which is sad. When Mia finds out she's a princess, her friends have sort of abandoned her because she really only has Lily, who is in the book, by the way, and she never really had any other friends besides, and people are crap. She gets to hang out with Tina, who totally understands her now having to have a bodyguard everywhere, who, you know, now that she's got this different status, she had someone who understood a little bit more, and I really quite liked that element, and I missed that, and I think I would have liked that in the film, I think. Sometimes with films, they try to minimize characters because it can get a little confusing if you have too many. It can be like that in books also, but this was done really well where it wasn't confusing with, you know, several other characters. We also had some characters getting more or less time than in the movie. So her teacher, who started dating her mum, got a little bit more time in the book. There was a little bit more involvement with him early on. And then, you know, you still had Lana and Josh and Michael, but they had slightly different roles. So altogether, the book ended sort of at the equivalent of the beach party where Josh kissed her in front of the cameras just to get his 15 minutes of fame. That's where the first book really sort of ended, except that instead of a beach party, it was a dance at school, or a cultural celebration event, dancey thing at school instead of a beach party, which was an interesting shift. I didn't mind that, actually. It was fine, didn't have to be a beach party, no big dealy. But he was definitely the same. He did the same thing. He kissed her in front of all the cameras just because he wanted to be known as the princess's boyfriend, whatever, blah, blah, what a douchebag. And on top of that, they really went a little bit more in the book into things like, you know, the fact that Josh drank really, really heavily, and that it was just a different dynamic, really. But because this was one section, always happens with book versus movies, they always condense it somewhere, and some things get cut, some things get added just to make the film more filmish, flow better in a film format. But yeah, I think that I was disappointed that the Lily character was so unforgiving in the book. In the movie, they had a bit of a falling out. They didn't really, I think they fought and they didn't talk for like maybe a few days, but in this book, in the beginning of the book, they really fight for a long time. It's weeks before they actually decide to speak to each other again. So Lily was quite unforgiving. She was really, they both were really social justicey. Ask me about my thoughts on meat, the meat industry, like we're going to Greenpeace. Like they were really cause-worthy type teenagers, which they didn't really do that in the film. I didn't really care one way or the other if that was going to be in it or not, but some of those huge changes really made a difference. It really made you hate almost all the other characters in Mia's life, but you still liked Mia. And also, one of the big things too, her big makeover scene, they put stick-on nails, which is really funny, as a girl to hear about stick-on nails for the first time. And in the book, she doesn't get her hair all straightened really pretty, she just gets it all chopped off. So she ends up with like, I think it's almost like a pixie cut type style hair. And that's really quite different. Going from having like frizzy shorter hair to, I think it was like crazy hair, to absolutely short and styled. But, you know, the Michael character was still into her and still liked her, and he was so intellectually smart though. Him and Lily were both very smart people. They're smart cookies in the book. So, and that was an interesting new dynamic to add in there as well. And they were rich. They were rich too. Oh gosh. Anyway, so lots of changes, lots of things to consider when you're deciding which was better or worse. I think for the sake of likability of all characters versus only one, I preferred the movie. I liked the dynamic between Anne Hathaway and Julie Andrews, and I thought that even though Julie Andrews still played, you know, an aristocrat who was royal and who was very, you know, she was elegant, she wasn't nasty, and I think in the book her character, the grandma, was nasty instead of elegant and poised, and, you know, and plus the Grandmere character in the book didn't have Joe to pull her up on her crap, and I think that was important. But I think it actually worked really well to have the dad die in that dynamic, not to be able to tell her in person. I don't know if maybe she kills off the dad in the next few books, I have no idea. But when it comes to book one versus the first half, I guess, of the movie, yeah, those are my thoughts. I think I prefer the film, just because the characters were a lot more likable in the film, and, you know, even though I still liked Mia, I just didn't like the rest of them in the book. Do you like Princess Diaries? Have you read or seen the movie? What are your thoughts? Are you surprised with some of my thoughts? Or do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments below. There are more book versus movies to come, so I hope you're enjoying this series as much as I am enjoying to watch and read these guys. I'll see you in the adventures.